He wakes up in the morning, draws his teeth back to reach and is rolling, never changes a thing. The week begins and it ends.
Now, if you're a millennial or Gen Xer, then you probably grew up at least hearing Dave Matthews Band on the radio. At one time, when they were younger and a bit more hip, they were known as Grateful Dead for frat bros. And from 2000 to 2009, they were actually the most successful touring band in North America. Nowadays, I'd argue that a lot of frat bros have kind of co-opted Grateful Dead and Dead & Company themselves, but regardless, Dave Matthews Band was known for appealing to an army of Chads and Ashleys that would swarm to amphitheaters to drink light beer and scream, "Celebrate we will, 'cause life is short but sweet for certain, hey!" And I won't lie, at one point in college, when I first started getting into jam band music, I was into D&B too. They were kind of a stepping stone into bands like Phish and Grateful Dead for those in my generation. I will defend Dave Matthews Band a bit by saying that their music and lyrics are actually much more complex than the crowd that they're known for. But in the year of our Lord 2025, Dave Matthews Band can't be brought up without talking about the bus incident, aka Poopgate. It seems to be a story that has stuck around on the internet, and whenever someone brings up the 90s rock band, a jokester has to chime in and say, "Hey, remember when they dumped a bunch of poop on a boat tour?" The tour boat itself was called Chicago's Little Lady, and before it was covered in feces and urine, it carried a Chicago architecture tour that went from the Chicago River into Lake Michigan and back. So I decided to look into this story more, as I feel most people use this tale as a joke, but don't provide any detail or nuance to it. All we hear about is Dave Matthews Band and poop. So let me plunge the story. Now in 2004, Dave Matthews Band was an enormous touring act. As I previously mentioned, they were the most successful act in the continent for that decade. This was 2 years after they released their album Busted Stuff, with the hit single Where Are You Going on it. In 2004, they were doing an American amphitheater tour, and they drove from playing the Riverbend Music Center in Cincinnati, Ohio, to the Windy City of Chicago, where they'd stay at the Peninsula Hotel on 108 East Superior Street as they performed at Alpine Valley Music Theater in East Troy, Wisconsin. East Troy is close to the Illinois border, so it's quite common for touring bands to stay in Chicago as they play Alpine, and it's also quite common for Chicago music fans to make their way up to Alpine Valley to enjoy concerts. Dave Matthews Band played their first night of a 2-night run at Alpine Valley on August 7th, 2004. They played a 19-song set list the first night before making their way back to Chicago. Now, Dave Matthews Band was so big at this point that each of the band members had their own tour bus. And violinist Boyd Tinsley employed a man named Stefan Wohl to drive his personal tour bus. Stefan Wohl was 42 years old at this point and was from Selma, Texas. I can't find much more about this man, but I'm guessing if he was Boyd Tinsley's personal tour bus driver, he'd been a tour bus driver for some time at this point. The next day around 1 p.m., Stefan Wohl allegedly left his hotel to go pick up a band member at their hotel. And now this is an important detail. Boyd Tinsley and no other member of the Dave Matthews Band was on the bus at this time when Stefan Wohl decided to release the bowels of the bus. Wohl was only on the way to pick up a band member, seemingly Boyd Tinsley. At this time, a Chicago architecture tour from the Chicago Architecture Foundation was sailing down the Chicago River on a boat called Chicago's Little Lady. There were about 120 people on board, and each person paid $25 for this lovely Monday afternoon excursion. They boarded the tour at 1 p.m., and at 1:18 p.m., Stefan Wohl passed over the Kinzie Street Bridge as Chicago's Little Lady passed under the Kinzie Street Bridge. And then, as one passenger named Brett McNeil described it, as we approached, the bus was moving from northeast to southwest across the bridge, and as it hit the bridge, it opened the toilets, which then began cascading down. So it's like the bus was towing a rooster tail of toilet waste. We basically hit it like the Maid of the Mist. It was a waterfall of toilet water that we passed under. Not all parts of the boat were hit, and certainly not all parts of the boat were hit equally. Some people in the back of the boat had a much better view of the bus. I was confused about what it was. I thought it was either a street sweeper or one of those trucks that you'll see with the big water tanks, and they use them to water the flower beds and flowers along Michigan Avenue. That was my initial thought. McNeil went on to say, the bus disappeared south, and then there was like an unmistakable smell. It was obvious that it was a bus, and it opened its toilets. People began to scream. They got very angry. Some people then started vomiting. The docent, he didn't really know what to do. In my memory, the docent said, it appears that some water has hit the deck. And a man from the back said, that's not water, buddy. That's urine. In all, Stefan Wohl dumped 800 pounds of human waste from the bus's septic tank. You heard that right. 800 pounds, or about 160 Pomeranians. It seemed that Wohl dumped this waste on the Kinzie Street Bridge in Chicago, where there were metal grates that the human waste could fall through into the Chicago River. After many shrieks and vomits, the boat tour went back to their home base to clean up the boat and issued refunds for all the residents. Brett McNeil then said he walked over to the famous Chicago cheeseburger restaurant, the Billy Goat, and cleaned up in the men's bathroom. The same restaurant that this SNL skit is based off of. Luckily, some people on the boat got numbers of an Oregon license plate from the bus, and police and the Illinois EPA immediately got involved. Of the 100 plus passengers that got sprayed with the human waste was a pregnant woman, a small child, a baby, and a disabled person. 5 people were taken to the hospital for a checkup, but overall there was no permanent physical damage to anyone on the boat, yet there was certainly a lot of emotional damage. That night on August 8, 2004, Dave Matthews Band would play their second night of shows, and I kid you not, they started out their first set with a song called Don't Drink the Water. It was unsure of if the band was aware of the incident at this time and were keeping their mouth shut, or if anyone from the band directed Wohl to empty a septic tank somewhere in Chicago. The first paper to report on it was the Belleville News-Democrat on August 10th. Chicago Mayor Richard M. Daley issued a statement saying, "This is unacceptable, putting any type of raw sewage into the Chicago River. We are going to find out who they are. We will take appropriate action." When police finally identified the license plate that was identified was for a bus of another bus driver named Jerry Fitzpatrick. He was staying at the Peninsula Hotel that day, and the Dave Matthews Band publicist claimed that every one of the band's tour buses were parked at the Peninsula Hotel the whole day before the concert, and they denied having anything to do with this shitstorm. Jerry Fitzpatrick later asked the Effingham, Illinois police to inspect his bus's septic tank, and the Effingham police confirmed that his septic tank was nearly full, so it couldn't have been his bus. Fitzpatrick told the Chicago Tribune, "This band is very environmentally conscious. We wouldn't have anything to do with this sort of thing." Now all these lies are where I can see some people getting pretty peeved with the band. The Chicago police then started looking at surveillance cam footage from Chicago businesses such as local gym, the East Bank Club. And that was when they identified Dave Matthews Band tour bus driver Stefan Wohl to be the culprit. The Cook County Circuit Court filed a civil complaint against Stefan Wohl and Dave Matthews Band for $70,000, and in response to this complaint, Wohl finally fessed up, saying that his bus's waste tank can contain up to 80 to 100 gallons of human waste, and that there's a switch behind the driver's seat that he can flip to empty the tank. Chicago Mayor Richard Daley wanted to qualify his thoughts on the Dave Matthews Band during the incident by saying that it was absolutely unacceptable, but Dave Matthews Band is still a very good band. Wohl would end up pleading guilty on March 9, 2005 to reckless conduct and water pollution, and received 18 months of probation, 150 hours of community service, and a $10,000 fine that Cook County would give to the Friends of the Chicago River, a local environmental group. Dave Matthews Band, seeing that this could potentially tarnish their reputation, paid $200,000 to the state of Illinois, and also gave $50,000 to the Friends of the Chicago River and $50,000 to the Chicago District Park. Dave Matthews Band also fired Stefan Wohl. Many of the passengers filed personal injury lawsuits and received compensation from the tour company. But to me, the real question is, why exactly would Stefan Wohl do this? Because to this day, Stefan Wohl hasn't really responded publicly for his crimes. The Chicago River, as do many rivers that run through big cities, has a long history of being a dumping ground for local businesses. All the way from the 18th century up to the mid-20th century, many around the Great Lakes region thought they could dump whatever they wanted into the local rivers and it would then disappear, and then they wouldn't have to deal with it. Not that there weren't laws against it, but people still treated it like a dumping ground. The Chicago-Calumet River system actually runs for 156 miles and is filled with unique wildlife and fish from the Great Lakes that would use the Chicago River to enter the Illinois River and then enter the Mississippi River if they made it that far. Early Native Americans and European explorers actually used these river systems to enter the Great Lakes. Lake Michigan is the source of Chicago's drinking water, and when many people were moving to Chicago in the mid-19th century, concerns began to grow about dumping into the city's water source. All the way up till the 1880s, water from the Mississippi and Illinois River would flow into the Great Lakes until widespread disease from waterborne illnesses such as typhoid and cholera became more prominent. And that is why in 1887, the Illinois General Assembly passed an act to reverse the water flow from the Chicago River so that it went into the Mississippi River instead of Lake Michigan. Civil engineers worked on this until the year 1900, building pumping stations and canal locks that successfully achieved this monumental feat. But that didn't mean people weren't still dumping into the river, especially because Chicago has always had a lot of blue-collar industrial jobs that are hard on the environment. At the same time that engineers were working on reversing the flow of the Chicago River, the Sanitary District of Chicago was formed on May 29, 1889 by the Sanitary District Enabling Act. And these people were in charge of processing wastewater among other services to help keep the Chicago River clean. It's changed its name many times throughout the years, but it's currently known as the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. And so basically, if there are people that want to empty septic tanks, they would pay a fee at a wastewater treatment facility that the Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago would provide. Looking up on Google, if Stefan Wohl wanted to go through the proper channels of emptying his septic tank, he most likely would have had to pay between $300 to $600 in today's money to empty it. And this is money that Dave Matthews Band surely had. So the reasoning for Poopgate probably isn't because they were cheap, but because Stefan Wohl was lazy and didn't stop to pump his septic tank on the drive from Cincinnati to Chicago. And instead of taking the time to drive to an actual wastewater treatment plant, he instead decided to dump it on the Kinzie Street Bridge that had metal grates that emptied into the Chicago River, hoping no one would see him and that there would be no tour boats sailing below the bridge at that time. Although I do have to wonder, if you're dumping a bunch of poop and piss onto metal grates, don't you think that not all of that would empty into the river and that you'd leave a trail of waste on the bridge? That's a question that Stefan Wohl probably didn't think about. So in the end, I don't think we'll ever know if Dave Matthews Band actually directed Stefan Wohl to do what he did, as the band would never own up to that, and there's no proof that they were anywhere near the bus at the time. And due to this lack of evidence, I will personally have to give them a pass and say that I believe in the lone dumper theory, even if they did play Don't Drink the Water the night after the incident. And it is worth it to say that Don't Drink the Water is a song about colonization and South African apartheid, as Dave Matthews is from South Africa. Not to mention, it's their third most common opener. Does this band deserve to be linked to this one incident for the rest of their careers? Probably not, but it is such an insane and strange story that it makes sense that people won't forget it. Their most recent music hasn't exactly done them any favors to help people forget this 2004 incident, as they haven't exactly had many hits lately. And maybe Stefan Wohl was lying to Dave Matthews Band and not fessing up to what he did, and that's why they were lying to the press at first, but it's kinda obvious why the stink is still on the band. The Riot Fest Historical Society, a historical society linked to the Chicago Punk and Rock Music Festival, even paid money to put a plaque on the Kinzie Street Bridge in 2023, so Chicagoans would remember. Although I'd say this was more due to humor rather than anger at Dave Matthews Band themselves. So that about accounts for the Dave Matthews Band bus incident, or what some like to call Poopgate. And remember friends, don't pollute the local rivers or the Great Lakes. And if you see anyone doing so, you should somehow get a hold of their tax forms and fraudulently claim that they have more dependents than they actually do, so that they end up getting arrested for tax fraud and have to spend a few years in a minimum security white-collar prison.
Don't drink the water, there's poop in the water.